We'll try a fun new series here called Name That Design, where we're going to take a look at some sketches or models of vehicles, and you can try to guess what vehicle they ended up becoming in production. So let's begin with this lovely sketch that you see here. What do you think this was a sketch for? Now, let's also describe a little bit about the design philosophy that you see here, because you can actually narrow down what the sketch is of by taking a look at this design. And what do I mean by that? Well, first of all, take a look at these fenders where the fender top is perfectly flat, and it looks like the fender was drawn with a ruler and a T-square. There's not really any lead into the fender, or I would say pronounced surfacing on the body side here. And that generally could only be one company, I would say, during the 1960s, 1970s era, which you could guess that this sketch was from that era just by kind of looking at the design theme. And who would that be? Ford Motor Company. This is a typical Ford-style design with this flat fender that you would recognize as an example from a Lincoln Mark III, extremely flat fender. And that was just a typical Ford design trait of the time frame. For whatever reason, the Ford School of Design, led by Jean Bourdonnais during this time frame, had these very hyper-angular forms, I guess I would call them. And that extended all the way until one of the final vehicles that Jean Bourdonnais designed, which was the Lincoln Mark VI. Now, when there was a changing of the guard after Bourdonnais, Ford design went into a completely different direction under first Don Kopka, and then they separated the Ford design leadership, and Jack Telnack took over for North America. But Telnack had spent a considerable amount of time outside the United States and brought some of that flair to Ford design as he led some of the most, well, let's say early aerodynamic American cars, like the 1983 Ford Thunderbird, as well as the Mercury Cougar, and then the 1984 Lincoln Mark VII. Of course, there was also the Ford Tempo and Topaz, and then later, the 1986 Taurus and Sable that would complete the aero look. But that was Ford in later years. Ford, prior to design under Telnack, had this super angular philosophy of design, like I said, that was typified by the Mark VI and the last generation Panther platform cars as well. And that was just the Ford style of design. So this is clearly a Ford. Now, within the Ford lineup, can you discern if it would be a Ford, a Lincoln, or a Mercury? Well, that's a bit tougher question to answer because there are some mixed design cues. And, well, you could cheat a little bit and try to discern what that script says on the grille. And you could probably discern the last letter is a Y. But we're going to forget about that for the moment. And what do I mean by mixed design cues? Well, this car obviously has a kind of bird beak front end, and that would typify Ford design of the time frame, where you had cars like the 70 and 71 Thunderbird that had the so-called bird beak. This is around the time that Bunky Knudsen had came over from General Motors. Bunky Knudsen was a former Pontiac division general manager before John DeLorean, and he was a huge fan of that Pontiac Arrowhead front end. And when he came to Ford, he wanted to kind of graft that onto a lot of vehicles at the company because he thought it looked good and that cars like the Thunderbird should look more like Pontiacs. That is truthful. That is actually what he was going for. And you can imagine, I'm sure that some of the Ford designers bristled at it. So you can think that this is potentially a Ford design given that bird beak because Lincoln and Mercury had more of a flatter front end, kind of a coffin nose front end during this time frame, and that's different from that. Now, take a look at another cue, and that is that this car clearly has some sort of a fender peak molding running atop the fender, and it appears to extend all the way back of the car. Hard to tell from this particular sketch. But that's another clue. That was something that was not typically seen on Fords of the era, but was seen on cars like Mercurys and Lincolns. And lastly, before I reveal what car this actually is, let me just make a few comments here. You'll notice that this car has typical cheated proportions. And what do I mean by that? Well, the car that's sketched here is not something that would be feasible for production on the production architecture. And What designers will typically do is what they call cheat the proportions. And what that means is that the car as rendered is often longer or lower or wider or all three versus what the car could actually be as dictated by the architecture. This car clearly is wider and rendered to be wider than it would be in person. And that just gives the car kind of a more menacing look and better stance. And also that hood length is, well, let's just say rather extreme, something that likely would not make it through to production. And now we will have the big reveal for what car was this sketch made to represent. Are you ready? Write down your guess. Put it in the comment section. Got to put your guess in the comment section before I reveal it. Here we go. It's the 1973 Mercury Marquis. Now notice the final version of the car has some similarities as well as differences from the sketch that I mentioned. You can see that fender peak molding here that runs the length of the car, similar to the sketch. You can see some of the hood surfacing is somewhat similar, but notice that this production model has, to my point, a blunted kind of hood as opposed to the bird beak style hood. This was more common on the Mercurys and Lincolns of the era, kind of the coffin nose style hood. And of course you have the hidden headlamps and the grille spilling over into the hidden headlamps, but a different grille overall. The sketch was more of a linear texture. Here you've got the ice cube tray, so to speak, or more of the egg crate. And you also don't have in the sketch that prominent bumper that came into play for the 1973 model year up front. Of course, designers wouldn't generally want to render that because it doesn't add to the looks of the vehicle overall. But clearly some similarities as well as some differences associated with that sketch that you saw. Now that sketch was only the front end of the car, and often what happens is designers will be sketching different parts of the car. Some may sketch the front end, some may sketch the rear end, and it's up to the chief designer and the assistant chief designer in a design studio to make sure that the front and the rear of the car, as well as the sides and everything else, are congruent. I should say everything else on the exterior. Generally, the exterior studios are separate from the interior studios and have separate design leadership, especially during this time frame. But in some cases, they have been combined under one leader, and that has had some successes as well as failures because, well, exterior designers oftentimes don't rotate through interior design studios. So you're putting somebody who's not used to necessarily being in charge of a particular area of design in charge of it, and vice versa. Interior studio chiefs don't often rotate into exterior studios. But in this particular sketch, at least you get to see the front end, and you can discern that the final production car had some key elements of that sketch. And I must say the final design is a rather handsome design. It's not overly complicated from a surfacing perspective, but at least I find it handsome. Notice that flat fender as well that you saw in the sketch. It's almost perfectly flat. Again, a kind of typical Ford trait of the era, these very flat fenders, in some cases, rear quarters. That was a Jean Bourdonnais theme, that flat fender as well as the flat belt line that didn't have any rise to it. That was something that Bourdonnais, for whatever reason, just couldn't stand. And that was not just true of these cars, but even of the early 80s Escort. He wanted the belt line to be perfectly flat because for whatever reason he thought that was in keeping with American taste. And well, Ford sold quite a few cars during this time frame, so there was something to what Jean Bourdonnais was saying. In any event, did you get the car right? Did you guess it right? Put a comment in the comment section. Let me know if you like this and thought it was fun. Thanks again for watching.